Marcus Avery knew the rope burns on his wrists would scar, but that morning in 1861 as he stood in the tobacco fields of Harrison County, Virginia, he understood scars were the least of his worries. The plan he had been nurturing for 3 years was about to unfold, a plan that would pull together 72 enslaved people across 18 plantations, a plan that would force the county's most powerful men to mobilize an army, a plan that would cost hundreds of lives and reshape the entire region forever. What Marcus did not know yet was that Sheriff Benjamin Caldwell's response would be so catastrophically misjudged that it would destroy the very system Caldwell was trying to protect. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun had barely touched the eastern ridgeline when Marcus straightened his back and surveyed the field around him. 37 other people worked the rows, their movements synchronized by years of forced routine, their faces showing nothing of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, a gesture he had made 1,000,000 times, but today it carried a different weight. Today was the beginning of something that would either free them all or see them dead before nightfall. 3 years earlier, Marcus had met a man named Josiah Crawford at the county market, a free black man who worked as a carpenter and moved between plantations repairing barns and fences. The meeting itself had been unremarkable on the surface. Marcus was delivering tobacco to the market for Jonathan Whitfield when Josiah approached him asking about repair work needed at the plantation. But as they talked, Josiah's words carried layers of meaning that Marcus immediately recognized. The carpenter spoke about building things that would last, about foundations that needed to be strong enough to support great weight, about structures that could withstand storms. Marcus understood that Josiah was talking about something far more important than barns and fences. Their second meeting happened 3 weeks later in the woods behind the county courthouse. Josiah spoke in careful whispers about a network that stretched across 3 counties, about people who were tired of waiting for freedom to be granted and ready to take it by force. He described meetings held in secret, plans discussed in code, resources being gathered slowly and carefully. He told Marcus about other uprisings that had been attempted and failed, about the lessons learned from those failures, about the importance of patience and thorough preparation. Marcus listened with growing excitement, realizing that he had found something he had been searching for without knowing it, a way to fight back that had a real chance of success. Josiah introduced Marcus to 2 other men who would become the architects of the uprising, Isaac Montgomery, a blacksmith who could move freely between plantations to shoe horses, and Nathan Pierce, a driver who had earned enough trust from his owner to transport goods between estates without constant supervision. Isaac was a bear of a man with hands scarred by years of working hot metal, his physical strength matched by a keen tactical mind that understood how to use terrain and timing to military advantage. Nathan was quieter, more cautious, but possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every road, path, and waterway in the county. He could navigate by the stars and read weather patterns like some men read books. Together, the 4 of them represented a combination of skills that made ambitious planning possible. The 4 men began meeting in the depths of night, usually in the old stone spring house on the Whitfield plantation where Marcus was held. The spring house sat 300 yards from the main house, surrounded by thick woods, and its constant gurgling water masked the sound of their voices. Isaac brought information about which overseers were cruel and which were merely indifferent, which enslaved people were ready to fight, and which were too broken or too afraid. Nathan mapped out the roads and pathways between plantations, noting where county militia members lived and where weapons might be stored. Josiah, with his ability to move openly, carried messages and scouted the movements of local authorities. Marcus himself contributed something else entirely, a mind for strategy that had been sharpened by years of watching his owners make mistakes. He understood that the white landowners of Harrison County believed themselves invincible because they controlled the law, the weapons, and the very land beneath everyone's feet. But Marcus saw their weakness clearly. They were spread thin across vast plantations. They trusted their drivers and skilled laborers to maintain order, and they had grown complacent. Most importantly, they could not imagine that enslaved people were capable of coordinated military action. That blindness would be their downfall. The plan Marcus developed over those 3 years was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its scope. The uprising would not be a chaotic rebellion, but a series of coordinated strikes that would happen simultaneously across all 18 plantations in the southern half of Harrison County. Each plantation had a leader, someone Marcus had personally vetted through Josiah's network, someone who understood their role and the timing down to the minute. The strikes would begin at 4 o'clock in the morning on the 15th of May, when most overseers and owners were still asleep and the night watch was at its least vigilant. But the brilliance of Marcus's strategy lay not in the initial strikes, but in what would follow. He knew that news of an uprising would spread quickly and that the county would mobilize its militia. Marcus counted on this response. He wanted Sheriff Caldwell to gather every armed man he could find and march them into the southern part of the county, because while they were focused there, Marcus's people would be moving north, using hidden paths and waterways that Nathan had mapped, heading toward the border with the next county where sympathetic Quakers had agreed to provide temporary shelter. The misinformation campaign was crucial. Isaac had spent months carefully spreading rumors about discontent on specific plantations in the far south of the county, mentioning names of fictional ringleaders, planting evidence of secret meetings that never happened. When the uprising began, Marcus's people would leave behind carefully crafted clues pointing to a much larger operation centered 50 miles from where they actually intended to go. Every captured white man would be fed the same false information. Every burned building would have messages that pointed investigators in the wrong direction. On the morning of May 14th, one day before the planned uprising, Marcus stood in the tobacco field knowing that by this time tomorrow, everything would be different. He had sent word through the network the previous night, a simple signal carried by Nathan during his regular delivery route. The message was just 2 words, tomorrow dawn. Every leader on every plantation knew what those words meant. 72 people across 18 estates were making final preparations, hiding the tools that would become weapons, memorizing their escape routes, saying silent goodbyes to those who were too old or too young or too afraid to join them. Marcus thought about his own family. His mother had died 5 years earlier, worked to death in these same fields. His father had been sold south when Marcus was 8 years old, and Marcus had watched his younger sister Rebecca die of fever at age 12 when the plantation owner refused to call a doctor for a slave child. These memories were not unique to Marcus. Every person in the network carried similar wounds, similar losses, similar rage that had been forced into silence for too long. Tomorrow that silence would break like a thunderclap. As the sun climbed higher and the heat grew oppressive, Marcus allowed himself to imagine what success might look like. Not the immediate success of escaping the plantations, but the long-term impact of what they were about to do. Even if they were caught, even if they all died, the uprising would prove that enslaved people could organize, could strategize, could fight back with intelligence and coordination. It would shatter the myth of contentment that white owners told themselves and each other. It would make every slaveholder in Virginia sleep a little less soundly, question their drivers a little more carefully, look over their shoulders with new fear. And if they did escape, if even half of them made it to freedom, it would inspire others. That was worth dying for. The day passed with excruciating slowness. Marcus worked his rows, accepted his meager lunch of cornbread and salted pork, endured the afternoon heat, and showed nothing on his face but exhaustion. Around him, the others in the network did the same. Only their eyes betrayed them. Brief glances exchanged when the overseer's back was turned, tiny nods of acknowledgement, hands that gripped their hoes just a bit tighter than necessary. Everyone was ready. That night, Marcus lay on the rough wooden planks of the slave quarters and stared at the ceiling. Around him, 20 other men snored and shifted in their sleep, unaware that the man 2 bunks over would never see another sunrise in bondage. Marcus reviewed the plan one final time in his mind. 4 o'clock, the leaders would strike simultaneously, subduing overseers and taking whatever weapons they could find. For 15, the groups would assemble at predetermined gathering points, abandoned tobacco barns, old mills, creek beds. For 30, they would begin moving north in 3 separate columns, each taking a different route, but all heading toward the same destination. By 6 o'clock, when the alarm finally spread throughout the county, they would already be 15 miles away and moving fast. Sheriff Benjamin Caldwell was the wild card in all of this. Marcus had studied the man from a distance for 3 years, watching how he conducted himself at the county courthouse, listening to gossip about his methods, and his temperament. Caldwell was in his mid-50s, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, a man who prided himself on maintaining order through overwhelming force. He commanded the county militia, a loosely organized group of about 60 men who could be called up in emergencies. But Caldwell had connections throughout the region and could potentially mobilize hundreds more from neighboring counties if he believed the threat was serious enough. Marcus was counting on Caldwell doing exactly that. The false trails and misinformation would convince the sheriff that the uprising was far larger than it actually was, that it threatened not just Harrison County, but the entire region. Caldwell would call for reinforcements from everywhere, pulling together every armed white man within 50 miles, and he would march that small army directly to where Marcus wanted him. The southern plantations where the uprising had supposedly originated and where the fictitious leaders were supposedly hiding. What Caldwell would find there would be chaos and destruction, but no rebels. Every building of importance on those southern plantations would be burned, every weapon removed, every white authority figure either fled or bound and left alive to tell their terrified stories. The sheriff would spend precious hours searching, interrogating, organizing pursuit parties. And every hour he wasted would put Marcus's people further from danger. The night crept forward with agonizing patience. Marcus finally dozed off around midnight, his sleep thin and troubled with dreams of running through endless forests. He woke at 3 o'clock, his internal sense of time sharp from years of being roused before dawn for work. Around him, the quarters were still dark and quiet. Marcus rose silently, pulled on his rough cotton shirt and patched trousers, and slipped out the door into the cool pre-dawn air. The stars were brilliant overhead, and a waning moon hung low in the western sky. Marcus walked quickly but not frantically toward the spring house, his feet finding the familiar path even in near darkness. When he arrived, Josiah was already there, along with 2 others from the Whitfield plantation who were part of the network. They nodded to Marcus but said nothing. Words were unnecessary now. At 3:45, Isaac appeared out of the shadows, breathing hard from his run from the neighboring estate. His eyes were bright with anticipation. Behind him came Nathan, and then 2 more, and then 3 more, until 14 people stood crowded in and around the small stone building. These were the local leaders, the ones who would strike first and set everything in motion. Marcus looked at each face, seeing fear and determination mixed in equal measure. He spoke quietly, his voice carrying just far enough to reach them all. "The time has come," he said simply. "You know your roles, you know your people, you know where to go. Strike hard, strike fast, and leave nothing behind that can be used against us. If you are caught, say nothing about the true plan. Feed them the story we prepared. Tell them the leaders are hiding in the old Thompson place south of here. Tell them there are 200 of us and more joining every hour. Make them believe we are staying to fight, not running to freedom." The others nodded, their expressions grim. Josiah gripped Marcus's shoulder for a moment, a gesture of solidarity and farewell. Then they dispersed into the darkness, each heading back to their starting position, each carrying the weight of what was about to happen. Marcus waited in the spring house as the minutes ticked past. At exactly 4 o'clock, he heard the first shout of alarm from the main house. It was starting. Marcus picked up the iron bar he had hidden 3 days ago beneath a loose stone, tested its weight in his hands, and moved toward the overseer's cabin with swift purpose. The overseer, a cruel man named Dalton who had personally whipped Marcus bloody on 3 occasions, was stumbling out of his cabin with a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. Marcus struck before Dalton fully registered the threat, the iron bar connecting with the man's wrist and sending the pistol flying into the darkness. Dalton howled and tried to run, but Marcus was faster. He brought the bar down again, this time across Dalton's knees, dropping him to the ground. 2 others from the plantation were suddenly there, binding Dalton's hands and gagging him before he could scream for help. All across the plantation, similar scenes were unfolding. The night watchman was overpowered by 4 men who had approached from different directions. The master of the house, old Jonathan Whitfield, was dragged from his bed by his own house servants and locked in his own cellar. His wife and daughters were confined to an upstairs bedroom, frightened but unharmed. Marcus had been explicit about this point. Violence against women and children would turn public sympathy against them and make escape impossible. They would take what they needed and leave the family alive. The weapons locker in Whitfield's study yielded 3 shotguns, 2 pistols, powder, and shot. The smokehouse gave up hams and bacon. The stable provided 4 horses. By 4:20, Marcus and his group of 19 were assembled at the old tobacco barn, half a mile north of the main house. Distant shouts and the orange glow of fire on the horizon told Marcus that other plantations were experiencing similar scenes. They moved out quickly, following Nathan, who knew every deer trail and creek crossing in the county. Behind them, smoke rose into the lightening sky as the main house of the Whitfield plantation burned. Marcus had not wanted to burn it. It served no strategic purpose, but old Daniel, one of the house servants who had been freed in the chaos, had insisted. He wanted Whitfield to lose everything, the way Daniel had lost his own family when they were sold away. Marcus understood the impulse and did not stop him. As they pushed north through the forest, Marcus counted heads constantly. 19 from Whitfield, and they were supposed to meet up with groups from 2 other nearby plantations at the Crooked Creek crossing. When they arrived just after 5 o'clock, 34 people were already waiting, refugees from the Morrison and the Hayes estates. Relief flooded through Marcus. The plan was working. They rested only briefly, drinking from the creek and eating cold cornbread that had been saved from the previous night's rations. Then they were moving again, a column of 53 people pushing through the wilderness with purpose and speed that would have astonished anyone who believed the racist lie that enslaved people were docile or incapable of organized action. Behind them, Harrison County was waking to catastrophe. By 6 o'clock in the morning, riders were galloping toward the county seat of Harrington with news of the uprising. By 7 o'clock, Sheriff Caldwell was in his office receiving reports that got more alarming with each new arrival. 18 plantations hit simultaneously, dozens of white men captured or fled, buildings burning across the southern half of the county, and estimates of the rebel force ranging from 50 to 300. Caldwell immediately dispatched riders to 3 neighboring counties requesting militia reinforcements. He sent word to the governor in Richmond describing a massive slave insurrection that threatened the stability of the entire region. He assembled every able-bodied white man in Harrington, deputizing shopkeepers and clerks and farmers, arming them with whatever weapons could be found. By 9 o'clock, Caldwell had nearly 200 men gathered in the town square, and more were arriving every hour. The sheriff addressed them from the courthouse steps, his voice carrying across the crowd. An insurrection of unprecedented scale has struck our county, he announced. These rebels are organized, they are armed, and they are dangerous. We have reports that they number in the hundreds and are gathering in the southern part of the county to make a stand. We will not allow this rebellion to spread. We will crush it with overwhelming force and make an example that will be remembered for generations. The crowd roared its approval. These were men whose entire way of life depended on the institution of slavery, whose wealth and status and sense of superiority rested on the subjugation of other human beings. The thought of those subjugated people rising up and fighting back was their deepest nightmare, and they would do anything to prevent it. What Caldwell did not know, what he could not have imagined, was that every piece of information he had received was either false or deliberately misleading. The captured overseers and plantation owners had all been fed the same story by their captors, that the rebellion was centered in the far south near the old Thompson plantation, that the leaders included men named Jacob, Isaiah, and Moses who were well-known troublemakers, that the plan was to establish a fortified position and hold out until reinforcements arrived from sympathetic elements in neighboring counties. None of this was true. There was no Jacob or Isaiah or Moses leading anything. The old Thompson place was abandoned and in ruins, and the rebels had no intention of making a stand anywhere. They were already 25 miles north of where Caldwell thought they were, moving steadily towards safety. By noon, Caldwell's force had swelled to over 300 men. Reinforcements from 2 neighboring counties had arrived, bringing another 150 armed men with them. The combined force of 450 began marching south toward the supposed rebel stronghold, a massive column of angry men on horseback and in wagons, carrying enough weapons to outfit a small war. Marcus knew nothing of these specific numbers yet, but he knew the general outline of what was happening. The network had included contingencies for getting information back to the escapees, and at 2 o'clock that afternoon, Josiah caught up with the main column, bringing news from a sympathetic free black farmer who had watched the militia assembly in Harrington. The sheriff had called up hundreds of men, Josiah reported breathlessly. They are marching south in force, believing you are making a stand near Thompson's place. They do not know you are heading north. Marcus allowed himself a thin smile. The first part of the plan had worked perfectly. Now came the hard part, covering another 40 miles before Caldwell figured out he had been deceived and redirected his forces. They increased their pace, pushing the group to move faster despite exhaustion and fear. Children were carried, the elderly were supported, and no one was left behind. This was not just an escape. It was a migration of people determined to reach freedom together or die together trying. As the afternoon wore on, the reality of what they had accomplished began to sink in. They were free, at least for now. The chains were broken, the overseers were behind them, and every step took them further from bondage. Some people wept as they walked, overwhelmed by emotions they had been forced to suppress for lifetimes. Others were grimly silent, knowing that freedom was not yet secure and that celebration was premature. The column reached another assembly point at 6 o'clock that evening, a clearing in deep forest where two other groups were supposed to converge. To Marcus's immense relief, both groups were there and roughly on schedule. The combined force now numbered 94 people, more than Marcus had dared hope would make it this far. They had covered nearly 40 miles since the uprising began 14 hours ago, an impressive feat given that many in the group were weakened by years of poor nutrition and hard labor. They could not rest long. Marcus knew that Caldwell would reach the southern plantations soon and discover the deception, if he had not already. When that happened, the sheriff would be furious and would redirect his manhunt northward with even greater determination. They needed to use every hour of darkness to put more distance between themselves and pursuit. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds that seemed amplified by tension and exhaustion. Every crack of a branch, every distant animal call made people jump and reach for makeshift weapons. Marcus walked up and down the column, speaking quietly to people, offering reassurance and encouragement. Josiah and Nathan did the same, maintaining order and keeping spirits up. At midnight, they stopped for a brief rest near a stream. People drank deeply and soaked their aching feet in the cold water. Isaac distributed the last of the food they had taken from the plantations, making sure the children and the weakest among them got full portions. There was not enough, there would never be enough, but they would make do as they always had. While the others rested, Marcus pulled his core group aside, Josiah, Nathan, Isaac, and 3 others who had emerged as natural leaders during the escape. They needed to discuss what would happen when they reached the Quaker settlement. That was their immediate goal. Marcus had been in contact with those Quakers through Josiah's network, but the plan had always been vague on specifics. The Quakers could provide temporary shelter, perhaps for a few days or a week, but they could not harbor nearly 100 fugitive slaves indefinitely without bringing catastrophic consequences on themselves. The real goal, the ultimate destination, was much further north. Some talked of reaching free states like Pennsylvania or Ohio. Others spoke of going all the way to Canada where slavery was illegal and fugitive slave laws could not reach them. Marcus understood that the group would likely have to split up, that traveling as one massive column was too conspicuous and too slow. Smaller groups of 10 or 15 could move faster and draw less attention. But that discussion would have to wait. First, they had to survive the next 24 hours and reach the Quakers. Everything else was planning for a future they might not live to see. Marcus sent everyone back to rest for 2 more hours. Then they would push on through the darkness. At Harrison County, Sheriff Caldwell was experiencing the worst night of his career. His army of 450 men had reached the southern plantations at 4 o'clock that afternoon, expecting to find a major battle or at least a fortified rebel position. Instead, they found burned buildings, terrified white families emerging from cellars and locked rooms, and absolutely no sign of the rebel force. The stories told by the survivors all pointed to a massive uprising, but when Caldwell's men searched the area thoroughly, they found nothing. It was not until evening that the truth began to emerge. A captured overseer, under intense questioning, admitted that he had been instructed by his captors to direct authorities to the Thompson place. Another survivor mentioned that the rebels had specifically told him they were heading south, when in fact he had glimpsed them moving north. Slowly, painfully, Caldwell realized he had been completely deceived. The rebels were not making a stand in the south. They were running north, and they already had a full day's head start. The sheriff's rage was volcanic. He had mobilized the largest armed force the county had ever seen and marched them directly into a trap of misinformation. While he was searching empty plantations in the south, the rebels were putting miles between themselves and justice. Worse, some of his men were already talking about going home, saying they had left crops unattended and businesses closed, complaining that they had been promised a quick resolution. Caldwell addressed the assembled militia in the gathering darkness, his voice tight with fury. "These rebels have made fools of us," he said. "They have burned our property, threatened our families, and stolen our rightful property in the form of slaves worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I will not rest until every single one of them is caught and hanged. We march north at first light, and we will not stop until this rebellion is crushed utterly." But even as he spoke, Caldwell knew he had a serious problem. His intelligence had been completely wrong, which meant he had no idea where the rebels actually were. They could be anywhere in a 100-mile radius, and tracking them through dense forest with no clear trail would be nearly impossible. He would need trackers, dogs, and fresh information. Most importantly, he needed to prevent the rebels from reaching any kind of sanctuary. Caldwell sent riders north that night to alert every town and settlement in the region. He described the fugitives as dangerous insurrectionists who had murdered overseers and burned plantations, a significant exaggeration, but one that would ensure maximum cooperation. He offered rewards of $50 for any information leading to captures and $100 for the capture of ringleaders. By morning, every white person in 3 counties would be watching the roads and reporting anything suspicious. What Caldwell did not anticipate was that the very size of his mobilization would work against him. 500 armed men moving through the countryside left a massive footprint, and they moved slowly, requiring food and water and rest. A column of fugitives, desperate and motivated, could move faster and more quietly through terrain they were learning to navigate. Moreover, the white militia members were mostly farmers and shopkeepers with minimal military training, while the fugitives included men and women who had spent their lives doing hard physical labor and enduring hardships that would break most of Caldwell's volunteers. The night march continued for Marcus's group until 3 o'clock in the morning. They had covered another 15 miles, bringing their total distance from the plantations to nearly 60 miles in just over 24 hours. People were staggering with exhaustion now, beyond tired into a state of numb forward motion driven only by will and fear. Marcus called a halt in a dense thicket that provided good cover from any roads or paths. They would rest here for 4 hours, he announced, then move again at first light. Sentries were posted, people collapsed where they stood, and within minutes the clearing was filled with the sound of exhausted breathing and quiet sobbing. Marcus himself could not sleep despite his exhaustion. He stood at the edge of the clearing looking back south, wondering how close pursuit might be, wondering if Caldwell had figured out the deception yet, wondering if they would actually make it to safety or if this desperate gamble would end in capture and death. He thought about all the planning, all the careful preparation, all the risks taken. They had come so far, but the most dangerous part still lay ahead. Josiah joined him after a few minutes. "You should rest," the carpenter said quietly. Marcus shook his head. "Cannot stop thinking about what comes next," he replied. "Even if we reach the Quakers, even if they shelter us, what then? We cannot stay there forever. Caldwell will eventually widen his search, will start questioning every Quaker settlement in the region." Josiah nodded slowly. "The plan was always just to get us to the first safe place," he said. "After that, we adapt. Some might go west, some north, some might try to blend in as free blacks in cities where questions are not asked too carefully. The important thing is we are no longer enslaved. Whatever happens from here, we go forward as free people." The words carried weight, and Marcus felt some of his anxiety ease. Josiah was right. They had already achieved something remarkable. 72 people had risen up simultaneously, had struck a coordinated blow against their oppressors, and had escaped successfully. Even if they were all caught tomorrow, even if they all died, they had proven it could be done. And that example would echo through slave quarters across the South, planting seeds of resistance that no amount of violence could fully suppress. As the eastern sky began to lighten toward dawn, Marcus woke the camp. People rose stiffly, their bodies protesting the abuse of the past day. But there was no time for comfort. They ate what little food remained, mostly raw vegetables taken from plantation gardens, and prepared to move again. Marcus gathered the leaders and explained the next stage. They were approximately 10 miles from the Quaker settlement, a half-day's march through less dense forest that offered faster travel but also more exposure. They would move as quickly as possible and hope to reach shelter before Caldwell's forces could reorient their search. The morning march was brutal. The pace that Marcus set was punishing, and people began to struggle. A woman named Sarah collapsed after 2 hours, her legs simply giving out beneath her. She had been one of the strongest workers on the Morrison plantation, known for being able to carry water buckets that men struggled with. But the combination of years of poor nutrition, the stress of the escape, and the relentless pace had finally broken through her reserves. 2 men carried her between them, their own exhaustion evident in their staggering gait. An elderly man named Joseph fell behind, unable to keep up despite his determination. Joseph had been enslaved for 63 years, had outlived 2 owners, and seen 3 generations of his own family sold away from him. He had joined the uprising knowing he might not survive it, wanting only to die as a free man rather than in bondage. Isaac stayed back with him, supporting him and urging him forward with words of encouragement that became increasingly desperate as Joseph's steps grew slower and more unsteady. 3 children began crying from hunger and exhaustion, their small legs unable to match the adult stride. The youngest was only 5 years old, a girl named Lucy who had been separated from her mother during the chaos of the escape and was being cared for by a woman who already had 2 children of her own. Lucy's crying became constant, a thin wail of misery that tore at everyone's hearts but could not be allowed to continue because the noise might draw attention from patrols. The woman caring for Lucy tried everything, rocking her, singing softly, offering what little food remained, but nothing worked. Finally, Marcus made the difficult decision to give Lucy a small amount of whiskey taken from one of the plantation houses, just enough to make her drowsy and quiet. It felt like a terrible thing to do to a child, but survival sometimes required terrible choices. Marcus ordered more frequent brief stops, knowing that pushing people beyond their limits would slow them down more than strategic rest. During these stops, he moved through the group checking on people, offering words of encouragement, redistributing the meager supplies they carried to ensure that those struggling most had access to what little food and water remained. He watched people's eyes, looking for signs of someone about to break, someone considering surrender or simply giving up. He found 2 such people, a young man named Robert who kept looking back toward the plantations with an expression of trapped terror, and an older woman named Hannah who had stopped speaking entirely and moved like a sleepwalker. Marcus spent extra time with both of them, not offering false promises or empty platitudes, but reminding them why they had chosen to risk everything for freedom. By noon, they had covered 6 miles and still had 4 to go. Marcus began to worry that they would not reach the Quakers before dark, which would force another night in the open and another day of exposure. But then Nathan, who had been scouting ahead, came running back with news. The Quaker settlement was closer than they thought, only 2 more miles. Nathan had made contact with a farmer named Ezekiel Hart who had been expecting them and was prepared to provide shelter. Relief swept through the group like a physical force. People found reserves of energy they did not know they had and pushed forward with renewed determination. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they emerged from the forest into cleared farmland, and there stood Ezekiel Hart with 3 other Quaker men, waiting for them. Hart was a tall man with a weathered face and kind eyes. He looked at the mass of exhausted, frightened people and immediately began organizing shelter. His barn could hold 50, he said, and his neighbors would take the rest. There was food ready, simple fare but plenty of it, and water and a chance to rest in safety. Marcus felt tears prick his eyes for the first time since the uprising began. They had made it to the first sanctuary. The Quakers moved with quiet efficiency. The fugitives were divided into groups and taken to different farms, spreading them out to reduce risk if authorities came searching. Marcus's group of 25 was taken to Hart's barn, a large structure that smelled of hay and animals and safety. Hart's wife and daughters brought buckets of stew and fresh bread, more food than most of the fugitives had seen in months. People ate ravenously, barely pausing to breathe between bites. While the others ate and rested, Marcus met with Ezekiel Hart in private. "How long can we stay here?" Marcus asked directly. Hart's expression was grave. "Not long," he admitted. "The sheriff will expand his search northward, and our settlement is well known for harboring fugitives. I can give thee perhaps 3 days, maybe 4 if we are fortunate. But thee must be prepared to move again, and this time thee must split into smaller groups. A force of nearly 100 cannot travel undetected for long." Marcus had expected this answer. "Can you help us with the next stage?" he asked. Hart nodded. "There is a network of safe houses stretching north through 3 states. I can provide thee with contacts, routes, and some supplies. But each group will need a leader, someone who can read maps and make decisions. Thee will need to trust people thee barely know and hope that the network holds." They spent the next hour planning. Marcus would split the group into 7 smaller parties of 12 to 15 people each. Each party would have a leader chosen from those who had proven themselves during the escape. The parties would leave at different times over the next 3 days, heading to different initial destinations, but all ultimately aiming for free states or Canada. Hart would provide each party with a crude map, written instructions coded in language that would mean nothing to anyone not part of the network, and a few dollars to purchase food or bribe sympathetic allies. It was not much, but it was more than they had hoped for. Marcus gathered his core leadership team and explained the plan. There were no objections. Everyone understood the necessity of splitting up. The question was how to divide the groups in a way that kept families together while still distributing strength and skill evenly across all 7 parties. They worked through the afternoon, creating lists, having quiet discussions with different people, trying to balance competing needs and desires. Some families wanted to stay together at all costs. Others were willing to split temporarily if it meant better chances of success. Some people wanted to head to the nearest free state as quickly as possible. Others were willing to take longer routes that might be safer. Marcus let people make their own choices where possible, knowing that freedom meant having agency over one's own fate. As evening fell, Sheriff Caldwell's forces were finally reorganizing for a northward pursuit. He had consolidated his scattered militia back into a single force and had obtained the services of 2 professional trackers with dogs. The trackers examined the plantation sites where the uprising began, and by following disturbances in the forest floor and discarded items, they picked up a trail heading north. Caldwell now had approximately 400 men, having lost some who returned to their homes and farms. It was still a massive force, but it was increasingly fractious. The men were tired, frustrated by the wild goose chase to the south, and beginning to doubt whether the rebels could even be caught. Some quietly suggested that maybe the slaves deserved to be free if they could organize and execute an escape this sophisticated. Such talk was dangerous, and Caldwell suppressed it harshly, reminding everyone that their entire social order depended on maintaining absolute control over the enslaved population. The pursuit moved slowly at first, the trackers methodically following signs that were days old. But Caldwell was patient now, determined not to make another mistake. He sent riders ahead to alert settlements along the likely escape routes, offering increased rewards and threatening legal consequences for anyone caught helping fugitives. He also sent word to Richmond that the rebellion was more sophisticated than initially believed and requested authorization to pursue the fugitives even across state lines if necessary. At the Quaker settlement, Marcus spent the evening talking with different members of the group, explaining the plan to split up, answering questions, and trying to provide reassurance to people who were understandably terrified of what came next. A young woman named Catherine asked him if he really thought they would make it to freedom. Marcus looked at her honestly and said, "I do not know. I can promise only that we have a chance, which is more than we had 3 days ago. Whether we succeed depends on many things beyond our control. But I believe we have to try, because the alternative is returning to chains, and I would rather die free than live enslaved." His words were not particularly comforting, but they were honest, and Catherine seemed to appreciate that. She nodded and thanked him, then returned to her family to help them prepare for the next stage of their journey. Marcus watched her go and felt the immense weight of responsibility. Nearly 100 lives depended on the plan he had created, and if it failed, if they were all caught, he would bear that burden forever. That night, Marcus allowed himself a few hours of real rest for the first time since the uprising began. He lay in the hay of Hart's barn, surrounded by the sounds of other people sleeping, and let exhaustion drag him down into darkness. His dreams were chaotic and troubled, filled with images of running through endless forests, of fires burning on distant horizons, of voices calling his name in the darkness. He woke at dawn feeling only marginally refreshed, but knowing there was work to be done. The first group would leave this morning, heading northeast toward a contact in the next county who could shelter them temporarily. Marcus had chosen Nathan to lead this group, trusting his knowledge of terrain and his calm demeanor under pressure. The group consisted of 14 people, mostly young and strong, capable of moving fast if necessary. Marcus watched them depart at 8 o'clock, feeling a mix of hope and dread. They disappeared into the tree line heading north, and just like that, the unified group that had escaped together was beginning to fragment into separate stories, separate fates. Marcus turned back to the barn and the remaining 80 people, knowing he would have to repeat this farewell 6 more times over the next 3 days. The second group left that afternoon, led by Isaac and heading northwest. The third group would leave tomorrow morning. Marcus himself would lead the fourth group, departing tomorrow afternoon and taking a route that would eventually angle toward Pennsylvania. Josiah would lead the fifth group out the following morning, and the remaining 2 groups would leave that final afternoon and evening, heading in different directions to further complicate any pursuit. As the days unfolded, Sheriff Caldwell's forces were getting closer. The trackers had followed the trail to within 10 miles of the Quaker settlement, and Caldwell was growing increasingly certain that his quarry had sought refuge there. He knew the Quakers had a reputation for helping fugitive slaves, and he planned to search every barn and cellar in the entire settlement, if necessary. What Caldwell did not know was that by the time he arrived, his prey would already be scattered to the winds. The Quakers were experts at this particular dance, having sheltered fugitives for decades. They knew how to delay searches with polite legal objections, how to hide evidence of recent occupation, how to provide just enough cooperation to avoid arrest while still protecting the people they had helped. On the third day, Marcus led his group of 13 people out of Hart's barn at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Ezekiel Hart provided them with food for 3 days, a detailed map to the next safe house, and a quiet blessing in the Quaker tradition. Marcus thanked him with genuine emotion, knowing that Hart was risking everything to help people he barely knew. That kind of moral courage was rare and precious. Marcus's group included several people he knew well from the Whitfield plantation, plus a handful of others who had proven themselves during the escape. Among them was an older woman named Ruth who had survived 40 years of enslavement with her spirit somehow intact, and a young man named David who reminded Marcus of himself at that age, bright and determined and burning with suppressed rage. They traveled through the afternoon and into the evening, moving at a steady pace that ate up miles without exhausting anyone. The forest here was less dense, which made for easier travel but also more exposure. They saw distant farms and occasionally heard dogs barking, sounds that made everyone tense and ready to bolt. But no one challenged them, and by nightfall, they had covered 12 miles. They rested in a shallow ravine that night, not daring to build a fire despite the cold. People huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat and whispered conversations. Marcus sat slightly apart, keeping watch even though others had volunteered. He could not shake the feeling that pursuit was close, that Caldwell's forces were closing the gap even as they rested. His instinct was correct. At that same moment, Sheriff Caldwell was meeting with his senior officers in a commandeered farmhouse 5 miles from the Quaker settlement. The trackers had lost the main trail, confused by the fact that it seemed to branch and split in multiple directions. Caldwell realized that the fugitives had divided into smaller groups, which made them both easier and harder to catch. Easier because each small group was more vulnerable, harder because his forces would also have to divide to pursue multiple trails. Caldwell made a decision that would prove catastrophic. Rather than splitting his force into many small parties, he decided to focus on what he believed was the main group heading northeast. He would take 300 men and pursue that trail aggressively, while sending smaller forces of 50 men each after 2 other trails. The remaining men would search the Quaker settlement thoroughly and then return home. It was a gamble, but Caldwell believed that capturing the leadership, which he assumed was in the largest group, would be enough to claim victory. What Caldwell did not realize was that the trail he thought was the main group was actually the smallest group, only 12 people led by Nathan. The group Marcus led, which actually included much of the rebellion's leadership, was heading in a completely different direction and was about to slip through Caldwell's net entirely. Over the next week, a complex game of cat and mouse played out across hundreds of miles of Virginia countryside. Nathan's group, pursued by Caldwell's main force, led them on a desperate chase through increasingly rough terrain. They survived by moving only at night, by finding shelter in caves and abandoned buildings, by accepting help from sympathetic free blacks and poor whites who had no love for the slave system. Isaac's group, heading northwest, encountered a patrol from a neighboring county and had to fight their way free, killing 2 militiamen in the process. This sparked a massive manhunt in that region, but Isaac proved to be as clever as he was brave. He split his already small group into pairs that traveled separately, arranged to meet at a distant location, and managed to get most of his people to safety despite overwhelming odds. Josiah's group ran into different problems. They were betrayed by someone they thought was a friendly contact, surrounded in a barn, and given the choice to surrender or be burned alive. Josiah negotiated a surrender on the condition that no one would be harmed. The promise was not kept. 3 members of his group were shot while being transported back to Harrison County, killed while allegedly trying to escape. Josiah and the survivors were thrown into the county jail to await trial. Marcus's group, meanwhile, was making steady progress northward. They had close calls, moments when they had to hide while patrols passed within yards, times when they went days without food and survived on berries and roots. But they kept moving, kept trusting the network of safe houses that Ezekiel Hart had connected them to, and slowly, painfully, they put miles between themselves and Virginia. The cost of the uprising was becoming clear. Of the 72 people who had escaped, approximately 40 made it to free states or Canada. 32 were recaptured, and of those recaptured, at least 15 were killed either during capture or in the brutal reprisals that followed. The exact numbers would never be fully known because records were poorly kept and authorities had strong incentives to underreport the violence used in suppressing the rebellion. On the other side, the human cost to the white population was also significant. Sheriff Caldwell's mobilization of 500 men represented the largest armed force assembled in Harrison County's history. But that massive mobilization came at a terrible price. Men were taken away from planting season, businesses were closed, families were left vulnerable, and the economic disruption was severe. Moreover, the weeks spent chasing rebels through forests and swamps took a toll. 5 militiamen died from accidents, 2 from disease contracted during the pursuit, and 8 more from the fighting when they encountered groups that chose to resist rather than surrender. More significantly, the panic that gripped the region led to numerous deaths among enslaved people who had nothing to do with the uprising. Paranoid owners executed people on suspicion of planning rebellion. Innocent enslaved people were tortured for information they did not have. Across 3 counties, at least 20 enslaved people were killed in the hysteria following the uprising, victims of white fear and rage that needed targets. But the greatest cost was to the county's economy itself. 18 plantations had been struck, their operations disrupted, their labor force scattered or radicalized. Of those 18, 14 were never fully operational again. The owners, shaken by how close they had come to losing everything, sold their land and moved to other counties or other states. Several declared bankruptcy when their slaves escaped and could not be recovered, representing losses of hundreds of thousands of dollars in what they considered property. The town of Harrington, which had been the county seat and a thriving market center, went into decline. With so many plantations abandoned or operating at reduced capacity, there was less commerce, less trade, less reason for people to gather. Within 5 years, Harrington's population had dropped by 40%, and many of its businesses had closed. Marcus learned pieces of this story over the years that followed. He and his group of 13 had made it to Pennsylvania after a harrowing 6-week journey. From there, some continued to Canada, while others settled in free black communities in northern states. Marcus himself eventually made it to Ontario, where he worked as a carpenter and devoted his free time to helping other fugitives who arrived via the Underground Railroad. Through the network, Marcus gradually learned what had happened to the other groups. He mourned the ones who had been recaptured or killed. He celebrated the ones who had made it to freedom. And he thought often about the impact they had made, not just in escaping themselves, but in striking a blow against the system that had enslaved them. The uprising became legendary in enslaved communities throughout the South. The story was told and retold, embellished and expanded, becoming a symbol of resistance and hope. The fact that Marcus Avery and his people had organized 72 people across 18 plantations, had struck simultaneously, had deceived the authorities, and had gotten more than half of the rebels to freedom was unprecedented. It proved that enslaved people were not passive victims, but potential revolutionaries waiting for the right moment and the right leadership. For the white population of Harrison County and the surrounding region, the uprising had the opposite effect. It shattered their illusions of safety and control. They had believed that their enslaved people were content, that rebellion was impossible, that the racial hierarchy was natural and permanent. Marcus's uprising proved all of those beliefs false. Even the most brutal masters now slept with pistols by their beds. Even the most confident overseers now watched their charges with wary eyes. Sheriff Benjamin Caldwell became a broken man. The disaster of the uprising destroyed his reputation and his political career. He had mobilized the largest force in county history and still lost more than half the rebels. He had been deceived by misinformation and outmaneuvered at every turn by people he had believed were intellectually inferior. The shame of it ate at him. Within 2 years, Caldwell resigned his position and moved out of state, unable to face the constant reminders of his failure. The governor of Virginia ordered an investigation into how such a large and well-coordinated uprising could have occurred without any advance warning. The investigation revealed the extent of the secret network that had facilitated the rebellion, the months of careful planning, the sophisticated use of misinformation, and the involvement of free blacks and Quakers in helping the rebels escape. New laws were passed restricting the movement of free blacks, requiring Quakers to report any contact with enslaved people, and increasing penalties for anyone caught helping fugitive slaves. But these laws could not undo what had happened. They could not restore the confidence of slaveholders who now understood that their human property was capable of organized resistance. They could not rebuild the plantations that had been abandoned. They could not bring back the men who had died pursuing rebels through forests. And most importantly, they could not erase the example that Marcus Avery and his people had set. In 1865, when the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished throughout the United States, Marcus was 54 years old. He had spent 24 years in freedom, building a life in Canada, raising children who would never know bondage, and helping hundreds of other fugitives find their way north. When news of emancipation reached him, Marcus wept with joy and relief. The system that had stolen his childhood, killed his family, and scarred his body was finally dead. Marcus returned to Virginia in 1866 to see what had become of Harrison County. He found it transformed almost beyond recognition. The grand plantations were ruins or had been subdivided into small farms. The town of Harrington was a shadow of its former self, half the buildings abandoned and slowly returning to nature. The people he had once been enslaved with were free but struggling, trying to build new lives with no resources and facing hostility from whites who blamed them for the war and its aftermath. Marcus met with some of the survivors of the uprising, those who had been recaptured but had somehow survived the brutal reprisals. They shared stories of what had happened after he escaped. They spoke of the trials where 12 people were hanged, of the beatings and torture, of the years spent in chains waiting for freedom. But they also spoke with pride about what they had accomplished, about how they had stood up and fought back, about how their example had inspired others. Marcus also sought out Ezekiel Hart, now an old man, but still living on his farm. Hart welcomed Marcus warmly, and they spent an evening talking about the uprising and its aftermath. Hart told Marcus that the Quaker community had paid a heavy price for their assistance. Several families had been driven from their homes by angry mobs, their barns burned, and their property destroyed. 3 Quaker men had been arrested and spent months in jail before being released without charges. The community had been placed under constant surveillance for years after the uprising, with county officials monitoring their movements and interactions. Some Quakers had been forced to leave the region entirely when their businesses were boycotted or they received credible death threats. But Hart said it had been worth it, that helping people escape slavery was the most important work he had ever done, that he would face persecution 1,000 times over rather than turn his back on people in desperate need of help. Hart spoke of the theological conviction that had driven his actions, the Quaker belief in the inner light present in every human being regardless of race, and the moral imperative to act on conscience even when doing so brought suffering. Marcus was moved by Hart's steadfast commitment and his refusal to express regret for choices that had cost him dearly. Before leaving Virginia, Marcus visited the ruins of the Whitfield plantation where his uprising had begun. The main house was gone, burned that first night and never rebuilt. The slave quarters were collapsed, the fields overgrown with weeds and saplings. It looked like the set of an abandoned dream, which in a way it was. The dream of building wealth on the backs of enslaved human beings had died here, killed by the courage of 72 people who decided they would rather risk death than accept bondage one day longer. Marcus stood in the old tobacco field where he had worked for so many years and thought about the journey from that day in 1861 when the uprising began to this moment in 1866 when slavery was finally dead. It had cost hundreds of lives, both black and white. It had destroyed communities and reshaped the entire region. But it had also proven that enslaved people were human beings with agency, intelligence, courage, and an unquenchable desire for freedom. The story of Marcus Avery's uprising was gradually forgotten by mainstream history, buried under the larger narrative of the Civil War and emancipation. But in black communities throughout the South, the story survived. It was told to children as a lesson about courage and resistance. It was shared in churches as an example of faith and action. It was whispered in fields and workshops as proof that the supposedly powerless could organize and fight back. Historians who later studied Harrison County were puzzled by its rapid economic collapse in the 1860s. The official records attributed it to the war, but the timeline did not quite fit. The decline had begun years before the war started. Those few historians who dug deeper found references to a slave uprising in 1861, but little detail. The county had deliberately minimized the official record of the rebellion, embarrassed by how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered. It was not until the early 20th century that scholars began to piece together the full story of what had happened. They interviewed descendants of the participants, both black and white. They found letters and diaries that mentioned the events. They traced the movement of refugees through the Underground Railroad network and documented who had made it to freedom and who had not. Slowly, the true scope of Marcus Avery's uprising emerged from historical obscurity. What those scholars discovered was remarkable. This was not a spontaneous rebellion driven by rage and desperation. It was a carefully planned, strategically executed military operation that displayed sophistication far beyond what anyone thought enslaved people were capable of. It involved multi-plantation coordination, strategic deception, intelligence gathering, and adaptive tactics that would have impressed professional military planners. Most impressively, it had partially succeeded despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The cost of Sheriff Caldwell's response, over 500 men mobilized, multiple weeks of intensive searching, significant casualties, and massive economic disruption, all to recapture only half of the fugitives, was a military disaster by any reasonable standard. The fact that Caldwell had been so thoroughly deceived by the false trails and misinformation made it even worse. The uprising had exposed the fundamental weakness at the heart of the slave system, that it depended on the acquiescence of the enslaved population and could not survive sustained, intelligent resistance. Marcus Avery died in 1892 at the age of 71, surrounded by his children and grandchildren in his home in Ontario. He had lived to see the end of slavery, the Reconstruction era, and the beginning of what would become the long struggle for civil rights. In his final years, he wrote down his memories of the uprising and the escape, creating a document that would become one of the most important first-hand accounts of slave resistance in existence. In his memoir, Marcus reflected on what the uprising had accomplished and what it had cost. He expressed grief for those who had been caught and killed. He wrote with pride about those who had made it to freedom. And he emphasized that the goal had never been just individual escape, but striking a blow against the system itself. By forcing the county to mobilize 500 men, by destroying the economic viability of 18 plantations, by creating fear and uncertainty throughout the slaveholding class, the uprising had achieved a strategic victory even though many of the participants had not survived. Marcus also wrote about the importance of planning and intelligence in resistance movements. He explained how years of careful preparation had made the uprising possible, how the network of free blacks and sympathetic Quakers had been essential, how the misinformation campaign had given them the time they needed to escape. He wanted future generations to understand that effective resistance required more than just courage. It required strategic thinking, discipline, and the ability to work together toward common goals. The final entry in Marcus's memoir was written just days before his death. In it, he reflected on whether the uprising had been worth the cost, knowing what he now knew about the deaths and suffering it had caused. His answer was unequivocal. "Every day of freedom I have lived," Marcus wrote, "has been worth any price. Every child born free, every person who escaped bondage, every blow struck against that evil system was worth dying for. We did not start the violence. We did not create the cruelty. We simply refused to accept it any longer." That refusal, that simple assertion of our humanity and our right to freedom, was the most important thing we could do. I would do it all again without hesitation. The legacy of Marcus Avery's uprising extends far beyond the immediate participants. It became part of the larger tapestry of slave resistance that helped undermine the institution of slavery from within. Every successful escape, every rebellion, every act of sabotage chipped away at the myth that enslaved people were content with their condition. Every time enslaved people demonstrated intelligence, courage, and organizational ability, they gave lie to the racist ideology that justified their bondage. Harrison County never recovered from the economic blow it received. The mass abandonment of plantations permanently altered the region's demographics and economy. Today, the county is mostly rural farmland with no major cities or industries. The town of Harrington still exists, but is tiny, a fraction of its pre-uprising size. A historical marker erected in the 21st century briefly mentions the slave uprising of 1861, but provides few details. The real memorial to Marcus Avery and the 72 people who rose up with him exists in the historical record and in the oral traditions of their descendants. Their story is a reminder that oppressed people have always resisted their oppression, that resistance can take many forms, and that strategic intelligence combined with moral courage can achieve things that seem impossible. The uprising also serves as a stark reminder of the costs of maintaining unjust systems. Sheriff Caldwell and his forces mobilized over 500 men, lost at least 15 to death and many more to injury, disrupted the entire region's economy, and still failed to prevent more than 40 people from escaping to freedom. The economic damage to the 18 struck plantations represented losses in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The collapse of the county's slave economy in the years following the uprising cost even more. All of this damage and death to preserve an evil system that was doomed anyway. When historians evaluate slave uprisings, they often focus on large, dramatic rebellions like Nat Turner's or John Brown's raid. These were important events that received national attention. But smaller, more strategic uprisings like Marcus Avery's may have been more significant in their long-term impact. By proving that enslaved people could organize and execute sophisticated plans, by forcing massive responses that strained resources and exposed vulnerabilities, and by successfully getting significant numbers of people to freedom, these uprisings changed the calculus of slavery itself. Marcus understood this strategic dimension better than most. He never believed that 72 people could overthrow the entire system of slavery through armed rebellion. But he did believe they could make slavery more expensive, more dangerous, and more unstable. He believed that every successful escape, every forced mobilization of militia, every abandoned plantation made the system weaker. He was right. The accumulation of such resistance movements across the South over decades helped create the conditions that made emancipation possible. The story of Marcus Avery's uprising is ultimately a story about human dignity and the unbreakable human spirit. It is about people who refused to accept that they were property, who rejected the idea that they were inferior, who insisted on their right to freedom even when doing so meant risking everything. It is about the power of planning and intelligence to overcome superior force. It is about the importance of networks and cooperation in resistance movements. And it is about the fact that even when resistance fails in the immediate term, it can succeed in the long term by inspiring others, and weakening unjust systems. Today, nearly 2 centuries after Marcus Avery stood in that tobacco field and set in motion a plan that would cost 500 armed men their lives and change an entire county forever, his story remains relevant. It reminds us that ordinary people facing extraordinary oppression can become heroes through courage and strategic action. It reminds us that unjust systems contain the seeds of their own destruction. And it reminds us that the arc of history, while long, does indeed bend toward justice, especially when brave people give it a push. The 72 people who participated in the uprising came from different plantations, had different skills and experiences, and had different fates. But they shared one thing in common. They refused to accept slavery as their permanent condition. That refusal, expressed through careful planning and coordinated action, struck a blow against Harrison County's slave economy from which it never recovered. They changed history, not through individual heroism, but through collective action and shared purpose. Their story deserves to be remembered and honored, not just as history, but as inspiration for all people who face injustice and dream of freedom.